Today we will go through the entire regulation to give you a little bit of insight about the details of what's going on in there. First, we're going to look at the rationale and objectives of the CRCF regulation, so why we, CRCF, that's Carbon Removal Certification Framework, why we began with this process. Then we will look into the EU-wide quality criteria that will be required when it comes to certification of carbon removals. We will look a little bit into the EU certification methodologies and the expert group that we established to help us with the technical details to set the methodologies up. We're going to look at the certification process, which I guess will be very relevant and pertinent to many of you here, and the CRCF registry, which should make things transparent. We are going to very briefly touch upon the options for the use of certified units, and then we'll look at some conclusions. First of all, so I guess you've all seen this chart before, and you probably know that the Commission has also issued recently the new communication on the 2040 EU target, which proposes to set out a minus 90% net emission reduction target for 2040. On our pathway to climate neutrality, which should happen at the latest by 2050, as stipulated in the European climate law, we will of course need to drastically reduce emissions. But not all emissions will be able to be reduced completely. So there are certain sectors which are so-called hard to abate, and we will need a certain amount of carbon removals to sort of compensate for that. And we estimate that we will need roughly double carbon removals that we have today. So that's what you see on this chart. It's in green and red. That is below the zero line, so it's the net removal, so with a minus sign in front. The carbon removal certification framework distinguishes between three groups of removals. One is carbon farming, the other one is permanent removals, and the third one is harvested wood products, so carbon stored in products, in raw materials. Carbon farming can mean many things. We can talk about conservation tillage, we can talk about precision farming, we can talk about agroforestry, for example, very interesting. We'll see a lot of interest in agroforestry. A lot of potential also in rewetting of peatlands and wetlands, of drained wetlands and peatlands. A lot of interest for forest management and reforestation. And there's also the option of blue carbon, so shallow coastal waters. The important thing to understand here, I think, is that the regulation that we're talking about now is a framework. So it does not narrow down on the activities that you can or you cannot certify. It leaves the door open as long as they fulfill the quality criteria that are required. This list is basically non-exhaustive. On permanent storage, we have so-called BECS, bioenergy, carbon capture and storage. We have DACs, direct air capture and storage. Under carbon storage in products, we would like to see an upscaling, a boost of use of long-lasting wood-based construction products, for example, in buildings and other carbon storing materials. The challenges here are that currently many of these applications are still quite costly, so we will need to deploy a certain economy of scale of it to reduce the costs, and we need to steer research to reduce those costs, and we also need to incentivize public and private financing to do that. So why, in the first place, we wanted to even engage in such a carbon removal certification framework? There are three main problems. First of all is, and I'm sure you've read about those in the news throughout recent years, that many stakeholders do not trust voluntary carbon removal certification. So therefore, we wanted to go over that. We wanted to sort of overcome those obstacles, and we wanted to come with a solid set of quality criteria that will induce trust that will bring trust, so that on the one hand they are feasible for stakeholders to do, and on the other hand that they are, that they store carbon with a reasonable amount of certainty, so that they are reliable. Second key problem was that it was difficult to assess and compare the quality of different carbon removals, because there were many schemes out there with many, very different approaches. And the third key problem that we're also trying to overcome is that it requires quite a stringent monitoring and reporting and verification rules, because after all, when you do carbon farming in agroforestry, in forest management, for example, you need to make sure that the carbon that you've stored and that it has been certified for is still there. So you need monitoring. So there are two main pillars to this framework. One is the quality criteria for all activities that are based in the EU. So we are talking about the EU space here. The quality criteria, the quality, it's an abbreviation that stands for quantification, additionality, long-term storage, and sustainability. And we'll go through all those together in a moment. And then we have a set of certification rules with third-party, with certification schemes and bodies, and third-party verification, so that we are indeed sure that things are going the way they should go, and that we create reliable removals. And then on top of that, we have the CRCF registry, which will be a public registry with all the main elements, with all the certified units that have been issued. Now, I've already mentioned that the CRCF regulation has been agreed upon, but this is just a framework, like I said already. So now we need detailed EU certification methodologies, which will actually operationalize in detail how the quality criteria will be used, will be deployed, will be applied for different activities. Because when it comes to, the framework is quite broad, right? You have different activities under carbon farming, different activities under industrial removals, for example. And so we need to now define how the carbon storage will be quantified, for example, or how you will prove additionality. So meaning that it's additional, so that it means that the project has indeed resulted in an additional amount of carbon storage in comparison to what would have been there had there been none of this project. And to do these certification methodologies, we are assisted by the Commission expert group that was established in March last year. It's composed of member states, but also researchers, many of the EU-level organizations also that are also dealing with forests, and NGOs, different organizations, and the aim of this expert group is ultimately to assist the Commission to prepare these methodologies. So we have 3 activities, I've already talked about that, and they will issue 4 different units. A permanent carbon removal, for example, direct air capture and storage, will create a permanent carbon removal unit, because we can claim that such a carbon storage is permanent. Carbon storage in products will create a carbon storage in products unit, and there is a minimum duration period in the regulation that was agreed upon by the co-legislators, so by the Parliament and the Council, on the other hand, which is 35 years. So if you, for example, construct a house out of wood, you will be able to get a certificate for it, but you need to ensure that it lasts at least for 35 years. Carbon farming, on the other hand, will issue 2 different types of units. One will be the carbon farming sequestration unit, and that's when you actually create removals. For example, you engage in an agroforestry project, you plant some trees, they will sequester carbon, and you will have a carbon removal, a minus sign, because it will suck, it will absorb carbon from the atmosphere. On the other hand, this framework also allows to certify soil emission reductions from agricultural soils. So you will also have the possibility to certify to get a soil emission reduction unit there. And this is also considered permanent. So we have 2 units that are considered permanent, and we have 2 units that are considered temporary. Now with temporary units, if the land manager, forester, farmer, group of operators, whoever, decide to extend the monitoring period, these units can be extended. But it all relies basically on the fact that the carbon stored needs to remain there. So you will need to somehow prove it, and you will need to extend the monitoring period. So these units can be extended almost indefinitely under the prerequisite of extending the monitoring period. And that is indeed, so we cannot call them temporary, because if you stop your activity, it can be reversed. But indeed, the incentive is we want to create removals that are as durable as possible. How we quantify carbon removals? So this is a very basic concept. So you basically take a baseline, like a scenario 0. The framework now, in terms of baseline, the framework now favors a standardized baseline, which should be a standardized baseline means that it's highly representative of the local conditions, soil type, region, climate, regulatory framework, all that kinds of things that have a reasonable homogeneity in a certain region. A standardized baseline has many benefits. It can reward early movers, so those that have been already doing a good job. It lowers administrative burden, and it lowers the cost, because you have one baseline for a larger, still localized, but for a larger area, and not the single operator is then liable to creating their own baseline and to justifying it. So you have like a general standardized baseline that all the operators in this region can use. When I talk about region here, it's not like region in administrative terms, like Nouvelle-Aquitaine, but it's more like it needs to respond to really local environmental circumstances and regulatory circumstances. If there is no such standardized baseline, then there is a fallback scenario where operators can calculate their own activity-specific baseline. And until we have the standardized baselines established, this will probably be a more appealing option. But the long-term idea is to really use the standardized baselines because it's easier, less costly, and less burdensome. So you have the baseline. Then you calculate how much carbon you will be able to store, how big of a removal you are able to create during a certain period of time with this activity. And then you also have to factor in direct and indirect greenhouse gas emissions. For example, you potentially needed to use more fertilizer for a certain activity that will cause emissions. You need to deduce that from the calculation, because you have, with that time, you may have caused additional direct emissions, for example, like that, or fuel use, or anything like that. So this is a basic principle, but as I said, it will be specific to every single activity as part of the certification methodologies. And of course, very importantly, the carbon removal benefit must be, of course, bigger than 0, right? Because otherwise, there is no point in doing it. So we've gone through the quantification, I think. Additionality, so you need to prove that indeed that the carbon stored is additional to what would have been there if the project had not been put in place, and that includes the regulatory obligations on the plot level. For example, if something is required by law, this cannot be claimed as additional. It needs to be durable, so we need to establish monitoring rules and liability mechanisms in case something goes wrong. We're talking about, for example, insurance mechanisms or buffer pools or something like that. And then we have the key concept of sustainability with minimum sustainability requirements. And so there are minimum sustainability requirements, such as, for example, that your carbon farming activity must not negatively impact biodiversity, for example, must not negatively impact on water pollution, things like that. There's very detailed text in the article. And there is a set of additional co-benefits that are more or less optional, but we see a lot of interest in those because they are very likely to increase the cost of the certificate issued. So this is really these 4 criteria that we collectively call the quality criteria are really the core part of this regulation that aim to induce trust and also increase the value of the certified units. The expert group, I've already talked about it a little bit, so the next meeting is next week. The next meeting is next week, where we will go, where the expert group, it will be a 3-day meeting where the expert group will go through the so-called technical assessment papers, where the Commission, with the help of consultants, have really gathered and brought together all the certification schemes that are already out there. We've brought it all together, we've analyzed them, we analyzed the pros and cons. So the important thing here to understand is that the Commission is not inventing a completely new wheel there under this expert group, but we really want to build already on the good practices that are already out there and try to remedy those parts of the certification schemes that maybe don't work, or maybe the society doesn't trust, or things like that. So really looking at pros and cons of what's already out there and try to upscale that a little bit. The main aim to now is that by the end of this year we come up with some draft solution of the first certification methodologies. That's the main idea for this year. Maybe one thing to keep in mind also is that, so there are many activities out there, many carbon farming activities. Already if you look into forestry, there are many, sub activities already in the forestry sector. So it will be also important, we cannot develop all the methodologies at once. So it will also be important to prioritize a little bit, and that's also why the expert group is there to make that decision. A little bit about the certification process. There's a lot of, so I thought in a way that many of the stakeholders present here today would be interested in that part. There's a lot of text, but maybe I don't want to bore you too much with all the text. You will get the presentation anyway after the fact, so it's for your reference. But just to say, there are certification schemes that are approved by the Commission that oversee the certification process simply of the operators. So you can have an operator, which is one farmer, one forester, one land manager, or it can be a group of operators. They can also, many member states in the EU like to work, especially when it comes to agriculture, like to work in so-called cooperatives. I think France is one of them, Italy as well. So we open this option wide and clear to have a group of operators collectively engaging in a project. And then you will have the certification bodies which will be accredited by national authorities, so by member states essentially, or can be a regional authority, but depends on how a country is organized. But it will be accredited by a member state, and these certification bodies will exercise periodical audits. So all this is to put in place a system that is trustworthy and that it's third-party verified, so that we overcome those trust issues that we've been reading about in the recent years. A little bit about the certification process. I've described it very briefly now. I think it's important to understand, and I can reiterate that once again. So if someone wants to continue their carbon farming operation, their carbon farming project, even beyond the initially planned activity period or monitoring period, they can do so. So if you decide to quit your project, the certified unit will become cancelled out. It will expire. But if you decide to continue the monitoring period, this certification unit can be extended. And this is to further incentivize that we really try to keep the carbon that has been stored in there where it is, and to incentivize also the new business opportunities for foresters, for farmers in there, to extend that monitoring period. About the CRCF registry, so this was an explicit wish of the co-legislators of the Parliament and the Council. So the Commission, in 4 years after entry into force of this regulation, will create a CRCF registry, which will make public all the certification information and track the quantity and use of the CRCF units. That is, of course, we need to take into account, data sensitivities, such as sensitive data and so on and so forth. But the idea is really to make a transparent registry of all the units that have been issued, of all the units that have been cancelled, that have expired, and with all the minimum data that feature into such a certificate. So, quantification, additionality, co-benefits, all the minimum requirements, and things like that. So there will be an EU-wide public registry that the Commission will sort of manage, and it will reflect everything that's going on in the EU on the certification mechanism. So a little bit about more detailed rules on the certified units. I think it's important to know here that the certified units will be issued by certification schemes ex post. So that's based on a valid certificate of compliance. So that's when you first engage in a carbon farming project, for example, and then you have to wait a little while until this really kicks in until it starts absorbing carbon. So there will probably be a need for a combination of modeling, where you at the beginning, you need to anticipate how much carbon we are actually able to store with a certain project. So a little bit of modeling. And then ex post, this certification unit will be issued with certain amount of tons and all the co-benefits that can be then used in carbon markets. So there has been a lot of fear about double counting. So there are very clear rules in there that the certification units cannot be used more than once, and they cannot be used by more than one legal or natural person at any one point in time. They cannot be used for third country NDC. Well, that's maybe more for the international community. So it cannot. It has to do with the Paris Agreement and this international forum. so it doesn't have to do so much with the EU. All right, so I've been talking about this, what will be visible in the registry already on the certified units. A lot of attention has been paid to the sensitivity of data, so we will not disclose any sensitive data there. And then I would like to touch upon, because this is a question that comes up quite often, what are the possible end uses of these certified units? Now, I think it's important to understand at this point that this regulatory framework is a voluntary framework. It's not, so you can do carbon farming and don't get certified for it if you don't want to. So it's a voluntary framework. But if you want to do certification, then there are certain rules as part of this regulation, how it's done. And consequently, there is also no blacklist or whitelist of the possible uses. Now, the European Union has various pieces of legislation where the end uses of such certified units could be defined or incentivized or limited. For example, you have the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, which, for example, deals and regulates climate claims. For example, if a company wants to claim carbon neutrality or something like that. You have the Green Claims Directive. It regulates how companies communicate with end consumers. So, you know, when you have a product and a company wants to claim that their product is carbon neutral, for example. Then you have the voluntary offsetting markets, and there are also strict rules on EU financing and state aid, of course. Carbon removals, maybe you're wondering how this will feature into the post-2030 climate framework. So again, this regulation is just a set of rules how we do certification. There are no specific targets. There are no specific sectoral targets, no targets for forestry, no targets for agriculture, no targets for industrial removals, and no targets for any member state. So it's really just a set of rules on the certification itself. It has links to the EU ETS directive, however, the emission trading system where there's energy, industry, you know, all these sectors that are part of the European emission trading system. And part of the LULUCF regulation. LULUCF stands for land use change, and forestry. And this regulation does have certain targets for member states on how much net sinks they need to achieve by 2030 for every member state. And then there's a collective target for the EU as well. Just to make clear, now that the carbon removal certification regulation is not yet incorporated into these pieces of legislation, and we will not change them until 2030. So the climate framework until 2030, with all the minus 55% and so on and so forth, with all the targets, remains as it is. And then post-2030, so the Commission has already issued a 2040 communication with a sort of envisaged economy-wide target for 2040. But sectoral pieces of legislation will still need to be developed for 2040, and that will be for the new Commission to make that political decision on how to proceed there. A lot of questions also about livestock emissions and whether you can certify units for emission reductions in livestock from enteric fermentation. For now, not. But it has been an explicit wish by the co-legislators to come back to this regulation in 2026, and until then to make a study whether that would be feasible, if that would be something that could be eventually included into the certification system. But so far, it's carbon farming, it's permanent removals, and carbon storage products. All right, so if that brings me to my final slide, if I may just make some conclusions there, the framework aims to speed up the deployment of high quality and trustworthy carbon removals and agricultural soil emission reductions in the EU, and all that with creating trust and reliability. So we want to fight greenwashing. It establishes the first ever EU-wide voluntary certification framework for permanent carbon removals, carbon farming, and carbon storage in products. The core of this piece of legislation is the 4 quality criteria that I've already mentioned, and we've talked a lot about them. So that's, just a reminder, quantification, have additionality, have sustainability criteria. And it also sets out the rules for third-party verification and setting up of the union registry. It provides new business opportunities to stakeholders, to land managers, to foresters, to farmers, and therefore enables access to additional private and public funding of carbon removals. We also expect these units to have a higher cost because they will be more reliable than, in general, than what's out there today. And therefore, we expect a bigger inflow of financing of carbon removals. Okay, that brings me, there are some more information there, just to say that we have launched with this provisional agreement reached, we have launched a new website with Q&A, questions and answers, with everything that you need to know. So very welcome to click and to surf, to browse those websites. But other than that, thank you very much for your attention, and very happy to engage in any discussion that we might have. Thank you.
Before we go to a little coffee break, and then we'll come back with the rest of the presentation and the round table, where Jurij will be part of it as well. But if someone has already any question about his presentation or about the framework, please put your hands up and you introduce yourself and the organization you belong to. Yes, please.
Good morning. I'm Paul Trobowski. I work at the Coopérative Alliance Forêt Bois in France. I have a question on this European certification. How is it going to work with a national certification? Is it going to replace the national ones? How are the two going to coexist? Because they're going to certify similar projects. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the question. I think that's a very relevant one and a very pertinent one. I would like to debunk this myth right away. All the certification schemes can coexist. So if you prefer to use label bas carbone, they can coexist. The idea with this certification framework and the methodologies that we are developing now and aim to come up with some drafts until the end of this year. It's not that we have reinvented completely a new revolutionary methodology, but it's to really build on what's already out there. We intend to take all the good examples from the different certification schemes that are in France, for example, Vera, international standards. We've looked across the ocean to the US, to see what's already out there and to understand how it works, to what extent it works, to what extent it doesn't work, and to take the good things and to, upscale them, upgrade them, to also try to overcome the obstacles that inevitably are there with the current certification schemes in place. And so you will most likely in the EU-wide methodologies, you will most likely find there are many common elements with what's already out there. For example, the label bas carbone. But of course, if you want to have it certified by this regulatory framework, you will need to adapt your current certification scheme somewhat, at least to a certain extent, because there are certain rules, as I said, the quality criteria, which are the core part. But we need to keep in mind that this will also most probably increase the trust, because it will be EU-wide. You will have third-party verification that will be approved by the Commission and then overseen by a public authority in the member state. And so we kind of expect that many certificates will gradually try to move to this uniform certification system. Thank you.
Okay, do we have any other question? Yes, please.
I was very interested in this presentation. I have a few remarks. I noticed that the work group should have completed its project by the end of the year. I heard that there were European elections in a few weeks, so I'm surprised by this statement. It's well known. Also, I would like to hear what is the budget, how many euros behind this process that is being developed in the service at the European Commission. I don't like accounting, but at one point you have to add and subtract. So the financial criteria is very important. So I would like answers. And thirdly, I don't go to supermarkets much, but I see some objects that are made of bamboo certified by FSC. So I asked questions, are you sure it's wood? They said yes. I checked. I thought maybe I lost my memory. Bamboo is an herb and not a tree. So they pretend that bamboo is a tree. FSC is a worldwide certification organization. They explain that it's wood. So I'm very surprised by the whole approach.
Thanks for your questions and comments. I'll take them one by one. So your first remark was about the expert group. So just to make clear, the expert group. The carbon removal certification framework is a piece of legislation. It's a regulation. So it's a legal text that is adopted. It's proposed by the Commission, which has the right to legal incentive, but is eventually adopted by the co-legislators. So that's the European Parliament and the Council of the European Union, which consists of 27 governments of member states. And they are the ones who adopt the regulation, and they have adopted it. The Parliament goes into election, as you rightly pointed out. We still hope that they make the final vote now in the plenary session in April, so that the regulation itself is adopted. That's the legislative part, processus législatif, I would say. On the other hand, the expert group is a technical body that is not political. I would not say it's scientific, but it's composed of experts from member states, of researchers, academia, of interest organizations like the one dealing with forestry, with agriculture, with permanent removals, whatever it be. So it's not a political body. It's a technical body that assists the Commission to prepare the methodologies. And as the methodologies are not part of the regulation itself, but are part of the secondary legislation, it's a bit complicated in terms of process, but just to point out that the expert group is by definition not a political entity. And so they are completely independent of the election process. They have to work according to what's in the basic regulation, which has been adopted. They cannot go over their mandate, which is set by the co-legislators in the regulation itself, but they work independently. So it doesn't have a lot to do with the election. On finance, so the Commission has made a lot of effort to try to alleviate the administrative burden and the financial burden from stakeholders, from member states. We are really doing a lot there. For example, when it comes to the registry, it will be the Commission setting it up and maintaining it. So that comes at no additional cost for anyone, either member states or the stakeholders. We talked earlier, at the early stages of my presentation this morning, we talked about a lot of overcoming challenges. And for example, monitoring, I made a strong point on monitoring. Monitoring is, I wouldn't say a challenge, but it needs to be there. We need stringent monitoring when it comes to carbon farming to make it reliable. Otherwise, if it's not reliable, we also cannot expect any high price of those certified units. Having said that, the Commission is in parallel running 2 additional pieces of legislation. We adopted in last year, we adopted in 2023 the new soil monitoring law, and we adopted in November 2023 a new forest monitoring law. And both those pieces of legislation, they are proposals for a regulation. They are not out there yet because we are negotiating now with the Parliament and with the Council. But they both aim to come up with a EU-wide, wall-to-wall, border-to-border monitoring system for soils and for forests. And this is to make an EU-wide comparable monitoring system that everyone can use at no additional cost. Everyone can use for whatever reason, be it for certification, be it to set the standardized baselines or project-specific baselines, or to prove additionality, things like that. And once these 2 systems, monitoring systems, come into place, we will have a really comprehensive monitoring framework that will benefit everyone, and with a particular attention to small landowners, to medium-sized landowners, foresters, farmers, who oftentimes, and that's rightly so, lack the resources, lack the finance, lack the knowledge to really engage in such a monitoring system. So I didn't want to talk about too much today because I really wanted to focus on the certification framework, but these are 2 processes, very important ones that are running in parallel. And once this is adopted, you will have you will see your costs, if you engage in carbon farming projects, for example, significantly reduced. So we are really trying to make a lot of effort to bring all that, and we have the reduction of administrative burden is very high on the priority list of our agenda. The third one, I'm going to have to, unfortunately, I'm gonna have to say that what FSC is and bamboo and things like that. I'm unfortunately not very familiar with these concepts, but I'm very happy to discuss with you. Maybe if you explain it to me a little bit better during a coffee break or so. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jurij.
So we're going to have a last question, and then we're going to have a coffee break for 20 minutes. Christopher Razio from IFC. You just said that to align the low carbon label with the European certification, you need small adjustments. Can you give example of adjustments? What are the differences that you seem to know the French system very well?
Thank you very much. So ultimately, I want to make it very clear, ultimately it's for the expert group to decide that. We have the expert group that has been established with the aim to assist the Commission to create those methodologies. It has been specifically designed not to include just member states, but also researchers, as I already mentioned. So we have really a pool of knowledge to come up with a solid methodology. And it will be for the expert group to come up with this draft. We are not yet there. As I said, we aim to have some kind of a draft for some activities by the end of this year. And we will have more clarity on that then. But we take very good note of what's already out there, including the label bas carbone. But I guess we'll have to wait for several more months to be able to answer that question. Thanks.
Thank you. So we're going to break for 20 minutes, and after the coffee break, we'll have the next three presentations. But if you have questions for Mr. Krajcic, he's going to be at the round table this afternoon, so you'll be able to ask him questions. So let's be back here at 10:30. Thank you.